Summer can be a bit of a slog. For us, it's often for some reason a rather busy time, and I'm sure we're not alone.
Well, you can beat the summertime sadness and the August angst and enhance your everyday with our excellent sponsor, Via Hemp. This is a company that crafts award-winning premium THC and THC-free gummies.
Each of these gummies is especially designed to cultivate a specific mood. Whether you're looking to get relaxed, get quality sleep, get creative, or just to get focused. If you're 21 or older, you can experience it for yourself and get 15% off your first order with our exclusive code MSheet at viahemp.com. That's VIIAHEMP.com.
I personally enjoyed their grapefruit flow state gummies. This CBG and CBD powerhouse really helped me tap into my productivity. Like, we have had an extremely busy summer, and I feel flow state got me over the finish line a few times when I was editing multiple episodes a day, digging through documents, and knocking out a bunch of interviews.
Via Hemp does not require a medical card, and it ships legally to all 50 states. It's also affordable, and even more so for Murder Sheet listeners who get a special deal.
If you're 21 and older, head to viahemp.com and use code MSheet to receive 15% off. That's VIIAHEMP.com and use code MSheet at checkout. After you purchase, they ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Enhance your everyday with Via.
This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites, like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies, like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee for your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
Achieving a gorgeous grin from home isn't a total mystery with Bite Clear aligners. Just don't be surprised if all of your sleuthing friends start asking, "What's your secret?" Begin by ordering your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95. Bite Clear aligners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces. Plus, they offer flexible financing, accept eligible insurance, and you can pay with your HSA FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
Content warning, this episode contains discussion of violence and murder.
On November 17th, 1978, 4 young people, Jane Freet, Ruth Shelton, Dan Davis, and Mark Flemons, went missing from the Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway, Indiana. Their bodies were discovered later that weekend in a wooded area some 20 miles away. All these years later, no one has ever been charged in the matter.
The Burger Chef murders is the first case that we worked on together. In fact, it's what brought us together. It remains uniquely important to us. We always encourage people to talk about it to try to keep the public interested in it. We really believe that consistently getting attention for a case can potentially help in eventually getting it solved.
So we were pleased to hear that there is a new podcast that is going to debut by offering a multi-episode look at Burger Chef. It is hosted by Chris Davis, who formerly hosted the 3C podcast, which also covered this case. Now, in the past, we've had some disagreements on this case with Chris, and of course, we do not necessarily endorse whatever conclusions he may make about the case.
But the thing is, we feel that having multiple perspectives out there on the case is really helpful. And one thing that we definitely agree on with Chris is that this case deserves attention, and the families deserve answers. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases.
We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is You Never Can Forget, an interview with Chris Davis, the host of True Crime Storytellers. let's start out by, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first got interested in this case?
Yeah, so my name's Chris Davis, and I am, for the most part, just a long-time true crime, fan and consumer of all of the different, formats, be it podcasts or, your Dateline TV shows and that kind of stuff. All the way back to Unsolved Mysteries when I was a kid. And then, of course, I've been a lifelong Indiana resident. My wife and I, actually, before we were even married, moved down to just outside the Speedway area. And I was listening to a podcast back in about 2017 that did just a one-off episode about the Burger Chef murders. And I started just hearing names of places that I drove by every day. And I was like, that's interesting, that's 2 blocks that way, and that's right next to or right across the street from the restaurant we eat at all the time, or the Kohl's we go shopping at. As far as the actual old Burger Chef building there on Crawfordsville Road. So I found the Facebook group and just started diving into as much as I could with old newspaper articles and the group and everything. And I'm just like, what really stood out to me was that so much of what was in that podcast that I listened to, and not to say that they did a bad job, they were just dealing with what I think is poor information that's been out there for decades, or at least lack of good information. It was like, they're just regurgitating so many things that don't logically make sense. So, let me dig into this. And one day I just came home from work and I told my wife, I was like, I think we can solve this case. Like, I don't know why. It's been a while. I don't remember ever being so bold about something that's so far outside of my lane. I'm a lifelong salesman. So, but I was just like, I've got to get involved with this somehow. And for the last 5 years, I've been neck deep in interviewing folks and obtaining files and reading old newspaper articles. And that's where we stand today.
And I know you had a podcast on this case in the past, but now you're getting ready to launch a new podcast on the case. Is that right?
Yeah. So back in 2019, with the help of my wife, we started the Circle City Crime podcast and kicked it off with the Burger Chef murders being our main focus. And, I'd long been a fan of the, crowdsourced type podcast where, you'll put out there the information you have, but make it clear, like this story's not complete. So if you've got an area of expertise, or if you've got a knowledge of certain people or certain areas or a certain era in time, especially when we're talking about a crime that took place so long ago, get involved here. That was the big thing, is wasn't trying to solve the case, even though I made that bold statement to my wife in my kitchen. It was, I think there's something that can be uncovered here, and with the right people talking about it in the right way, I think something can be done. And so that was the impetus to getting started there. And I just ran into a lot more hurdles and resistance than I expected. And, especially in regards to this case, in regards to getting a hold of files, in terms of, people around the case, be it, some of the victims' family members and some of the investigators, from back in the day, and just people who were maybe in the less than savory scenes back in the day that might have, good information. They were really open and had a lot of good experiences there. But with the current investigative team and everything, just trying to get a hold of, being able to verify good information and put it out to the public, that became very difficult. So we actually moved on to covering a couple other cases. And then when COVID hit, that became really hard because you weren't comfortable going into somebody's home and asking them for an interview because, you didn't know yet what the mechanisms were of COVID and how dangerous that was for folks. So I decided to step away. But with the release of the FBI files, and then just naturally, because I hadn't been involved in the case, some people coming to me with stories that kind of came to them after the FBI files came out, I've decided to kind of just do an update and, use that to launch a brand new podcast I'm calling True Crime Storytellers.
Will this new True Crime Storytellers podcast, will it be like 3C, which, as you said, was very much a deep dive into different Indiana cases, or will it be a mix of different things?
So we're definitely not going to focus solely on Indiana cases, and it will be different. But I will tell people, if there are people out there who happen to have enjoyed 3C and like that Indiana focus, Burger Chef isn't the only Indiana case I plan to cover. And we may get into a little more in a little bit the whole premise of the podcast, but the cases I cover is really going to be dependent on who's willing to join me on the journey on a certain case. So it's going to be deep dive, let's call it medium dive, and it's going to have a serious tone still. We're not here to laugh and joke about what's the most horrible day in these people's lives, whether or last day, unfortunately, for some of them. It's going to have a very serious tone still, but it's not going to take on that speculative tone, I think, that I had before, where I'm saying, hey, there's gaps in the information. I'm really trying to come with a completely congealed story for people.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the premise of the podcast. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so just blatantly, and you'll hear some of this in the first episode, kind of read out in a little better detail. But I had been kicking around the idea, especially after the FBI files came out again, of getting involved in podcasting. And I enjoy doing it. I enjoy the research. I enjoy the production. And obviously doing an update on the Burger Chef case. And I was just driving around one day and I was listening to another podcast and I heard a quote from Steve Jobs, went something along the lines of, those who tell the story hold the power. And it made me think about the experiences that I and you and Anya had as well, trying to get to the real story in these cases that we want to bring to the public and help find justice in. And you get these situations, especially here in Indiana, where the law enforcement or the judicial branch holds so much power and they're able to hold the narrative and then completely control the narrative, what gets let out, how it gets spun, who gets access to it. And I think with and I hope you would agree, Kevin, with the work we've done over the years in Burger Chef, and then, I'm trying to branch out and explore other people who have done similar work in other cases to take that narrative back. That's the premise is, this is an old unsolved case, whatever they've been doing for, whether it's 45 years in this case or 25 years in another, it's simply not working. Let's let a family member or somebody with knowledge of the case take that narrative back for the public, on behalf of the public, and quit just buying into everything that law enforcement says.
I think that's very interesting. I remember a while back on the show, we interviewed Michael Arnfeld, who is, among other things, a writer of true crime books. And he talked about how there should be like model legislation that if a law enforcement agency has not solved a murder in a certain amount of time, they should have to make the files available either to family members or to legitimate investigators. And it sounds like you would agree with that.
I agree with that. And it can be, there can be a lot of gray area in there. And you want to be sensitive to, the people that that truly have a connection to the case. I wouldn't say that, I'd be in favor of a law necessarily where just anybody or even anybody who holds a media credential could get access to a case after a certain amount of time. But, you and I have both had conversations with Ruth Shelton's sister. And, if she were to have faith in either one of us to cover this case in full with access to that case file, I think that should, after, 45 years, 25 years, some point, that should be partially her call. Sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you. I think there is a gray area. We have seen a huge spate of solves of cold cases using DNA in recent times, right? And wouldn't want, advances in technology to not really come to fruition in some of these cases because the files have already been released. But in other cases, it seems like there would be almost no reason not to release them because there is no DNA evidence, or basically it's kind of one last shot. I wanted to ask you, Chris, I don't even know how to ask this because it's so crazy. Do you ever, you've really delved so deeply into Burger Chef. as you were looking into it, did you ever feel like you were losing your mind? Because I think I'll tell you this. My perception of Burger Chef is on the outside, it looks like, okay, we can crack this. And then you get into it, and it's like driving around with a guy who's giving you directions, and you keep on coming to forks in the road or turnoffs and asking him, okay, which way? And it's like, well, you could go that way or that way. Who knows? And it's like, what? Like, I mean, that's how it feels to me. And I'm just curious, what's been your perception dealing with such an unwieldy, expansive case like that?
So here's where it's been two ways it's kind of, met those criteria for me. One, it's made me this usually has a negative connotation, but a very duplicitous person, in that most of the people in my private life don't know Chris Davis, the podcaster, or Chris Davis, the murder researcher. That's just not, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of people now, I guess, in my private life that I came to through the process of making the podcast, so they know me that way. But I don't know that anybody I went to high school with, anybody outside of my family besides my wife, my oldest son, and my parents, so it's been this weird dichotomy of like turning it off and turning it on, so there's that part of it that's a little bit more intentional, that can weigh on you a little bit. But the thing in specific relation to the Burger Chef case, where it gets frustrating and makes you think you might be crazy, is you wonder who's ever actually listening. This is a case where a lot of people had their solidly formed opinion on this case before I was even born. So here I am trying to not even necessarily change their mind, but just getting, hoping they'll be open to new information. It's like a phrase I heard today, and I hope I get this right. If I get new data, I have to reevaluate. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do. There's new data. I may have come to the same conclusion that Kent York did back in 1979. I may have come to the same conclusion as Mel Wilsey did back in 1986, if that's all the information I ever had. But there's new information. There's interviews. I'm gonna give some information on my podcast that came from an individual that I think should have had a dozen interviews with the Indiana State Police, and he says he has 0. And so his information is new information. And so that's the frustrating thing, is I'm not asking anybody to listen to my theory. I do try to do a lot of work to debunk the old theories, and I guess maybe from a vanity standpoint, I wish people would buy into that. But the biggest thing is be open to new information. And so often people are not. They just immediately fire back with, I don't need to hear it. I've known so-and-so did it since 1983.
This episode is sponsored by AutoTrader. Credit scores, down payments, interest rates. Car buying can be a numbers game, but you don't have to be a math expert to get the keys to your dream car. Just use Kelley Blue Book My Wallet on AutoTrader. Crunch your numbers and get your personalized results so you know exactly how much you'll pay each month for your car. It's like having a magic wand for your wallet. Presto! The car you've been wanting is now within reach. So hit the road and leave your calculator at home. Find your next car on autotrader.com.
What makes a life a good one? Is it the adventure you have? Or the friends you find along the way? Maybe it's pursuing your passion while striving to protect, defend, and save what you believe in every single day. So, what makes a life a good one? In the Coast Guard, we think it's all of the above and more, but you'll have to find out for yourself. Visit gocoastguard.com to learn more.
And that's where it really drives me crazy.
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm very tantalized and very interested in hearing your episodes where you feature this person who has never been talked to by the Indiana State Police. That will be very interesting. And secondly, you talk about trying to debunk old theories and things. What I think is interesting about that is when I personally look at some of the old theories about a case, whether it's this case or any case really, I think a part of me is hoping that the theory is true, because that means, okay, there's an answer here. And in this case, I was hoping, you mentioned Ken York, his theory was that it was a robbery gang. If that was true, that would provide us all with some closure. You mentioned Willsey. His theory was that it was a man named Don Forrester. If that was true, that would provide us with closure. Can you discuss a little bit the robbery gang and the Forrester theory and why you don't believe them to be true?
Yeah, and I'll start with I think that my desire to debunk theories came from exactly the same place where you say you start, seeing a theory and saying, let's prove this. Everybody else before us has been hitting singles. Let's hit the home run and see if there's a nugget here where we can prove this and relieve a lot of stress for everybody. And then you dive in and it's like, oh boy, there's a lot of information that hasn't been included in this narrative for all these years. So, I could spend several hours, which I plan to, on both of those theories. But just in short, in terms of the robbery gang theory, which the idea that this was a robbery gone wrong, a robbery where somebody was recognized, is not a poor theory. But that theory has been associated with 2 or 3 of a group of 5 men, basically ever since the week after these murders happened. And as you dig into each little part of it, whether it be the appearance of the men at the time of the murders versus the appearance of, potential suspects that were seen by eyewitnesses, or whether it be statements that were given that were then, misconstrued in the press, or whether it be timing conflicts on the night of the murders. There's a lot of avenues to go down where you got to say, before we stay so confident in that theory, we have to A, either find better proof, or B, put it on the shelf for a little while and go see if we can find something else that's a little more plausible. And the same thing is true with the Forrester theory. The big thing for me comes down to, a couple of things. One, investigators from the state police who were contemporaneous observers of everything that happened with Forrester, and will tell you that a lot of his information was bad at the start. He was fed information. He was interviewed in rooms with photos of, locations related to the murders and evidence related to the murders. So, that cast a shadow over it. And then, of course, having seen his tape statement / confession from 1988, and kind of understanding too his motivation in that he was having a tough time in prison at that time. And he had just seen back in 1985, hey, if I string them along, like I know something about these murders, they'll get me out of this bad place for a little while. And I think he thought the same thing was going to happen in 1988. But again, I've now seen with my own eyes, most of the information he gives there is very bad information and completely unfactual in relation to this crime.
I think it's so, I love what you're saying, because I think it's so important for people to keep in mind just the concept of a comfortable theory. I'll tell you, when, early on, if I probably would have wanted it to be Forrester, because he was punished. He was sent to prison for 95 years. He died there of cancer. And there's something comforting about, okay, well, the guy who probably did this, got his just desserts. But it's very, very uncomfortable for people to sit with the fact that we don't know who did this, and they might be enjoying life right now. It's not a good ending. And I think that prompts sometimes people to go towards a more comfortable theory. And I guess, how do you view that in terms of like how, at the same time, I guess all of us that, we're so in this that it might be tempting for us to kind of become hardened in our opinions. Like, how do you entertain different theories without necessarily becoming so dedicated to one that it blinds you to other alternative, explanations?
Well, I guess, personally, I have a lot of sympathy for the victims and sympathy for the victims' family and many of their friends still. still, talk about, the experiences they had with them and how much they miss them. So a lot of sympathy for them, and that's real. But I don't get attached in a positive or a negative way mentally to the suspects. So I think that's one way that it's helpful. Yeah, it's easy to just absolutely hate a guy like Donald Forrester, which if I step back and I'm not talking about this case, I could say all kinds of nasty things about Donald Forrester, but somehow, and I don't even know that I consciously chose to do this, but I have not really, when I discuss the suspects, whether it's suspects of these popular theories or suspects that I have generated, I just don't have any emotion about who they were. I guess with one exception, and you guys can vouch for me or not. I think Kevin knows that I've been pretty negative on the robbery gang theory for a while. But eventually I did get to speak with one of the men who was a member of that robbery gang. And I think because I had already kind of lowered my guard and said, I just don't think this is plausible, when I spoke to him, I had a very positive vibe with him. I had a very positive interaction with him and positive image of him going forward.
Right.
That's interesting. Earlier you were talking a bit about having to be duplicitous, and I think you were referring to how the people in your private life may not know Chris the podcaster. They may know a different person. But I was thinking another way that when you do this sort of work, you're a little bit duplicitous, is that sometimes when you talk to people who may be suspects or persons of interest, you can't always tell them everything you're thinking. I know, for instance, I spent a number of hours with Alan Pruitt, and my thoughts on Alan Pruitt and my opinions on Alan Pruitt are all over the map. But certainly there were times when I was sitting there talking with him and I was thinking, this guy could have done it. This guy could have been one of the killers. And of course, I never told him that. And I'm just curious if you had experiences where you were talking with someone and you thought they might be involved or have at least guilty knowledge, but you had to hold your tongue, and how did that make you feel?
Yeah, so I can think of two instances pretty clearly, actually 3 instances, two people. One of them happens to be a gentleman that you and I spoke with together at a bar in Canby, Indiana. As that conversation unfolded, I'll say right here, I stepped away from the table and I was recording the conversation, and I recorded in private that I feel like I'm almost sitting here listening to a confession. But I had to come back to the table and try to continue our conversation in the same clinking beer bottles, pleasant manner we had already been talking. So that was a little tough. The more I've learned, it'd be even hard. I don't know that I could do that with that particular individual to this day. I think if I were to speak to him again, it would have to be a very blunt conversation. And then there was another man who was, he and his brother were friends of Mark Fleming. And, when I first started talking to him, I felt like he's lived a rough life, a lot of involvement with drugs and everything. At first, it almost just felt like I was talking to a wall. But at some point, it actually began to appear that he was holding back information from me, and even that he was shielding his brother from me. It was hard to not just blatantly come out and say, look, I can't imagine a person acting the way you're acting and talking the way you're talking if you don't have more to say. So yeah, those interactions are real and something I never envisioned when I got involved in this, but yeah, very real. And I imagine you've been through plenty of that with not only Burger Chef, but Delphi.
Yeah, it's been some interesting experiences. One thing that I think, we appreciate about you, Chris, is that you've done, the shoe leather on the ground, talking to people, actually going out and talking to people or trying to talk to people. That really does make a difference in terms of understanding a complicated case. And, I guess maybe looking back before, you started this and then looking what you've done with not only Burger Chef, but some of the other cases that you've covered, how do you, like, it seems to me, and I'll just be curious on your take on this, that like oftentimes crime stories are a lot more complicated. Like you're only getting a small fraction of the information in the press. And how is actually looking into some of this stuff maybe altered your views on crime and how it's reported and things like that?
Well, because my original podcast focused on Indiana cases, I hate to paint this answer with too broad of a brush because I don't know how things work everywhere. And I think there are certain places, Florida, for example, with their much more open, public access laws, might work very differently. I could move to Tampa and start this podcast focused around Florida cases and maybe, go off like gangbusters. I don't know. But so I can only speak for, what I've experienced here. And it's an adversarial relationship that the state police, at least, seem to have with the media in that direction, from state police to media. But then the media seems to not be willing to be adversarial back and ask the hard questions, because then they know they'll lose access to whatever it is they are already getting. And so again, it goes back to what I said. The whole premise of the new podcast is hoping to be is that finding some way to wrestle at least a little bit of that control back from an organization like the state police. Another case I hope to discuss is the West Memphis 3. And I think you look at the way authorities have handled that case, not only in the original investigation, but in the CYA that's gone on, since that case gained all of its popularity and since the 3, convicted suspects there got out with their Alford plea. Like, there's just a tone of, we control the narrative, what are you going to do about it? And it doesn't sit well with me.
Our listeners are probably smiling now because they know we have some pretty hot takes on West Memphis.
We don't need to go into that
Spicy
now.
takes, but yes.
Well, feel free to, if I ever get there, feel free to listen and write a review.
Do you think the Burger Chef case is solvable?
I have to answer this by saying something that a lot of people are probably going to disagree with. I don't buy into the concept that information getting out hurts a case, especially a case that's this old. Now, when I first started my podcast, Delphi was a fresh case, and I felt that you would be interfering because they hadn't collected all of the information that needed to be collected. I think whether it's state police or Speedway police, they've been given every viable opportunity to collect all pertinent information. So whether now it's sharing the information they collected or going out and collecting new information and sharing it, they've had their opportunity. So I don't think that hinders a case. So I think that, with the right amount of discussion about this case, it's solvable. And I think there's some kind of evidence that could lead to something if it's tested the right way and tested against the right things or against the right people. I'll try not to spend too much of your episode, bashing current investigators, but I think, unfortunately, we've got a person in charge of this case right now that doesn't thoroughly understand the mechanisms of physical forensics and DNA and so forth.
Here's a question in regards to just kind of the premise of the new podcast. And I think you've made some very interesting points around like law enforcement and how police can really influence a narrative, how the media can be reluctant to criticize, which is definitely a phenomenon that's pretty obvious to behold. And frankly, I've seen it the other way too. I've seen in cases where there's a good defense team can really kind of grab hold of a narrative and set it as well. So I think there's different players in true crime stories that can really set a narrative and make it hard to really evaluate things objectively. What would your tips be for true crime listeners to try to amass information without necessarily letting these biases permeate, what you're consuming almost? Because I think sometimes it can be hard to even pick up on that happening until it's too late.
Well, I think you've got to look at the sources of information like a game of telephone. So if the source is firsthand, So if you're communicating directly with a witness, or let's say you're listening to a true crime podcast and the podcaster has a witness on there, what that witness says ought to be given not necessarily great weight, but great consideration. But then as you move away from that person, as you move to law enforcement telling you this is what we heard from a witness, or you move to a podcaster just saying this is what I heard from a witness, or a YouTuber or somebody on Reddit, which I wish somebody'd shut that website down, then then you've got to say, okay, we're getting farther along in this telephone game. So I can't give as much consideration to what I'm hearing. And now I say that to say I'm going to have to deliver some information in this Burger Chef case without divulging a source. I understand that by my own logic, that information should get less consideration from a listener. But I'm moving forward knowing where the information came from and therefore giving it a lot of consideration. So, yeah, I mean, it depends on what stage of the process you're in, whether you're just a listener, just a consumer, or whether you're actually in it. But I think if you just think about it all as a big game of telephone and how close you are to the source should determine how much weight you give. Again, not weight, not believability, but consideration, time thinking about, energy spent thinking about, is this true? Is this likely? Does this make sense? Does it sound like they're lying? That's kind of how I do it, both as a listener and as I'm trying to put together projects like this.
I'm curious, do you consider yourself to have a favorite theory in Burger Chef at this point? Not one that you're definitely 100% committed to, because we know that that's not how you roll. That's not how we roll either. But is there one that you kind of are feeling especially interested in at this point?
So I have two theories that could mesh or could remain completely separate. One theory is that this was not a robbery gone wrong, but whoever came to that restaurant that night was expecting someone else to be there. That was an initial target. And when that person wasn't there, but they had shown themselves to be aggressive and maybe even have been recognized by people by the four employees, or one of the four employees, that's when things went sideways. The other theory, and again, these two could combine at some point, is what I kind of call my bad penny theory. Whenever I kind of go down an avenue of whether it's victimology, whether it's geography, whether it's timeline, whether it's criminal history of individuals, knowledge of certain areas, similarity of types of crimes, far too often I come back to one individual. I've been referring to him now as my bad penny, and that's a man by the name of Daryl Crabtree.
Oh, yes. Bad penny indeed.
Yeah, in more ways than one.
Yes.
But if I don't go looking for him and then his name or his mother's name or his home address or a crime he was linked to or a prison he did time in pops up on my screen, and I'm just like, not this guy again.
Yeah.
So then I've got to give it some attention. I've got to give it some consideration.
Well, there's certainly a wealth of material for you to cover. I'm really looking forward to the podcast. Where can people find it?
So the plan is to, just as before with Circle City Crime, to be on all the major podcast platforms, your Apple Podcasts, your Spotify, your iHeart, those different things. I want to have, I'm going to run this a little different. Instead of calling these seasons, I'm going to call them series, and I'm going to try to produce every episode or a majority of the episodes for a given case before I even release them. And then, then we may go some time, be it 2 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, while I put together the next series on a different case. But the plan is right now to launch the first episode of True Crime Storytellers on January 15th.
Is there any social media or anything like that people can follow along to make sure that they stay up to date and don't miss it when it comes out?
Yeah. So, I haven't put all of that together. I'm going to be honest. I'm not planning on being as promotional as I was before. I doing a podcast, a true crime podcast, and feeling like your intentions are pure, but having to do this commercial thing so that what you think is very important information gets out to as many people as possible. I just don't feel like I'm comfortable with that anymore. I'm going to put it out there, and I appreciate you guys having me on. I know you've got a built-in audience that's hopefully going to give it a listen. And I'm part of the Facebook groups, related to the case. And I know there's some people in there who have said good things about my previous work. And, so I'll let them know that it's going to be out there, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple with what I'm doing social media wise. I have an email set up, simply True Crime Storytellers, and that's tellers with an S, plural, @gmail.com. And I'll also be True Crime Storytellers on Twitter, or X now. And then I do plan on setting up my own Facebook group for case discussion, which I don't have that set up yet. But again, it'll be the same kind of thing, True Crime Storytellers, discussion group on Facebook. So we'll start there, and I'm going to try as best I can to keep the focus to the production of the podcast and the accuracy of the information, and let the chips fall where they may as far as listenership and so on and so forth. But I appreciate you guys definitely with this first initial introduction.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Chris. We appreciate it, and we really can't wait to listen.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I look forward to sharing.
Thanks so much to Chris for coming on our show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.